Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. The smell of burning paper is distinct. It smells like dead history. In the grand city of Timbuktu, under a sky choked with grey smoke, 12-year-old Kofi was not crying. He didn't have time for tears. He only had time to run. His leather sandals slapped against the hard-packed earth of the alleyways, the sound swallowed by the chaos erupting 3 streets over. Men with torches were shouting in a language that sounded like grinding stones. They were not looking for gold. They were not looking for salt. They were looking for books. Kofi clutched a heavy leather-bound bundle to his chest, the edges digging into his thin ribs. It was the Kitab al-Nujum, the Book of Stars. His grandfather had told him that this single book contained math that Europe wouldn't discover for another for 300 years. Now it was moments away from becoming ash. Kofi ducked behind a mud brick wall as a horse thundered past. The rider was clad in foreign armor, holding a torch high. The rider laughed, tossing the flame onto a pile of scrolls that had been dragged into the street. Kofi watched, his heart hammering against the ancient text in his arms as centuries of medicine, law, and poetry curled into black flakes. This was not a robbery, it was an erasure. They didn't want to steal the African genius. They wanted to make sure no one in the future would ever know it existed. If they burned the evidence, they could claim these people were savages. Kofi knew this truth in his bones. He squeezed his eyes shut, the heat of the fire warming his face, and remembered his grandfather's command. They Kenyan born the city, Kofi. But if you save the ink, you save the soul. Run. He pushed off the wall, his legs pumping with desperation. He wasn't running home. Home was gone. He was running toward the desert edge where the shadows stretched long and deep. Every corner of the city was a trap. He saw neighbors dragging chests out of their homes, not filled with clothes, but filled with manuscripts, burying them in the dirt floors of their courtyards. It was a silent rebellion. But Kofi had the master key, the book that proved the earth orbited the sun long before Galileo was born. He turned a sharp corner and froze. Standing at the end of the alley, blocking his path to freedom, was a silhouette, a man. And he was holding a sword that dripped with something darker than oil. 3 days before the fire, the city had been different. Timbuktu wasn't a place of fear. It was the intellectual capital of the globe. Scholars in white robes walked the streets discussing astronomy, while merchants traded gold dust for salt. Kofi sat in the cool shade of the Sankore Madrasa, the university that made European castles look like barns. His grandfather, Baba Musa, was the keeper of the archives. The room smelled of dry earth and old leather. Look at this, Baba Musa had whispered, unrolling a map that looked nothing like the ones the traders used. It showed the coastline of the Americas. It showed currents and winds. They tell us the ocean is a wall, Kofi, but our ancestors knew it was a highway. Kofi had traced the lines of the map with his finger. Why don't we show the world, Baba? He asked. The old man sighed, a sound like wind moving through dry grass. Because, my son, power prefers a vacuum. If they acknowledge we built this, they cannot justify ruling us. Knowledge is the most dangerous weapon in the world. That is why I teach you the secret paths. Baba Musa spent the afternoon showing Kofi not just the books but the tunnels. Beneath the university, beneath the mosques, there was a labyrinth. It was designed for exactly this moment. For centuries, the librarians knew that one day envy would come knocking. They had prepared, but preparation implies you are ready for the betrayal. That evening, a stranger had come to tea. He was a man from the north, smiling with too many teeth, asking too many questions about the cataloging system. Kofi didn't like him. He noticed the man didn't look at the books with respect. He looked at them with hunger, but not a hunger for learning, a hunger for possession. Baba Musa, kind and trusting, had shown the man the preservation room. Kofi watched from the doorway, a knot forming in his stomach. The stranger's eyes didn't widen in wonder, they narrowed in calculation. That was the moment the clock started ticking. That was the moment the city was sold, not for gold, but for the silence of history. Back in the alleyway, the silhouette stepped forward. Kofi stopped breathing. It was the neighbor, Uncle Malik. But Malik wasn't holding a tool to help, he was pointing a finger. Behind Malik, two foreign soldiers stepped into the light. That one, Malik said, his voice trembling, his eyes fixed on the ground. He has the star charts. The old man gave them to him. Kofi felt a coldness wash over him that had nothing to do with the night air. Betrayal is a unique kind of pain. It doesn't sting like a cut, it aches like a broken bone. Malik had eaten at their table. Malik had held Kofi when he was a baby. Now Malik was trading Kofi's life for his own safety. "Give it here, boy," one of the soldiers grunted, extending a gloved hand. The soldier didn't look like a monster. He looked tired. He looked like a man doing a job which somehow made it worse. Evil isn't always a demon screaming. Sometimes it's just a man following orders to erase a culture. Kofi looked at the book, then at Malik. He saw the tears in Malik's eyes. Fear breaks men differently. It made Malik a coward. It made Kofi a warrior. He tightened his grip on the leather binding. He didn't speak. He calculated the alley was narrow. The soldiers were heavy, weighed down by armor and arrogance. Kofi was light. He was made of the wind and the dust. "I said, give it here," the soldier shouted, stepping forward. Kofi dropped the book. The heavy thud echoed. The soldier smiled, his guard dropping, as he reached down to grab the prize. In that split second, Kofi kicked a clay pot of red dye standing against the wall. It shattered, splashing vivid crimson liquid into the soldier's eyes. The man screamed, blindingly clawing at his face. It was chaos. Kofi snatched the book back up from the dirt, now stained with a single drop of red, looking like blood, and darted between the legs of the second soldier. He didn't look back at Uncle Malik. He left his childhood behind in that alley, along with his trust in neighbors. The city limits were a blur of screaming families and crumbling walls. Kofi didn't stop until his lungs burned like coals. He reached the edge of the Sahara. The desert at night is not like the desert in the day. It is a vast blue ocean of silence. The sand was already cooling, the heat of the day evaporating into the stars. This was the highway of death for those who didn't know the way, but for Kofi, it was the only sanctuary left. He wrapped his head in his indigo tegelmust, transforming from a boy into a ghost of the dunes. He had to reach the caves of Bandiagara, the secret cliffside vaults where the Dogon people lived. It was a 3-day walk. He had no water. He walked until the fires of Timbuktu were just a glow on the horizon like a dying sun. His legs shook. The book grew heavier with every step, the leather strap cutting into his shoulder. "Why does it matter?" a voice whispered in his head. "It's just paper. Drop it and survive. It would be so easy to bury it in the sand and walk away free." But then he remembered the lesson on page 42, the anatomy of the eye, the diagram showing how to cure cataracts, written centuries before Europe stopped treating sickness with leeches. If he dropped this, the world would go back to believing Africa was dark. He wasn't carrying a book, he was carrying the dignity of his ancestors. A sound broke the silence. The rhythmic thudding of hooves against sand. They were following him. They knew he had the master key. The invaders understood that burning the library wasn't enough if the master copies survived. Kofi threw himself flat against the slope of a dune, burying his body in the cool sand. He held his breath. The riders appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against the massive, bright moon. They paused, their horses snorting, scorning the endless waves of sand. Kofi lay perfectly still, his heart beating against the earth, praying that the desert would protect its own. Thirst is a cruel master. By the second day, Kofi's tongue felt like a piece of dry leather. The sun was a hammer beating down on the anvil of the desert. He had walked miles, but the landscape looked exactly the same. Panic began to rise in his chest. Had he walked in a circle? The heat waves distorted the horizon, creating shimmering lakes of water that vanished when he approached. Mirages. The desert was lying to him. He fell to his knees, the book tumbling from his grip. He was going to die here. His bones would bleach in the sun and the book would rot. And the lie that Africans had never achieved greatness would become the permanent truth. He opened the book. He didn't know why, maybe to say goodbye. The pages fell open to a chart of the constellations, the dog star, Sirius B. His grandfather had taught him that the movement of these stars predicted the seasons, the rains, and the direction of the oasis. Kofi looked up. The sky was blindingly bright, but he remembered the alignment. He looked at the shadows cast by the dunes. He realized he had been drifting east, towards the salt mines, towards death. The book wasn't just history, it was the survival guide. He adjusted his course, he forced his legs to move, he used the calculations of geometry from the text to estimate the distance to the cliffs. It was a surreal moment, a boy using high-level mathematics written in the 1300s to save his life in the middle of nowhere. It proved everything the book stood for. Science wasn't a Western invention, it was a human one, and his people had mastered it when others were still afraid of the dark. The realization gave him a burst of energy. He wasn't just a victim running away, he was a scholar applying his trade. He stood up, dusted off the cover, and marched. The Bandiagara escarpment rose out of the dust like the spine of the earth. Huge red cliffs, hundreds of feet high, dotted with small dwellings carved right into the rock face. Kofi stumbled toward the base, waving his arms. He had no voice left to scream. He collapsed just as shadows emerged from the rocks. Tall men wearing masks and stilts moved with an otherworldly grace. The Dogon, the guardians, they didn't run to him. They glided. They were the keepers of the deep secrets, the ones who knew about the stars before. The telescopes. They gave him water from a gourd, the sweetest thing he had ever tasted. They didn't ask his name. They saw the book. The elder of the village, a man whose skin looked like ancient bark, touched the leather cover with trembling fingers. "You brought the grandfather home," he whispered. They knew this book. It was one of the source texts. Kofi realized then that he was part of a network much larger than he imagined. Timbuktu was the head, but these villages were the heart. But safety is an illusion. That night, fires appeared at the base of the cliffs. The riders had tracked him. They couldn't climb the vertical rock face, but they could siege it. They shouted up from the valley floor, their voices carrying in the thin air. "Send down the boy and the papers, and we will leave you in peace." The Dogon elder looked at Kofi. Kofi clutched the book. "They will burn it," Kofi croaked. The elder smiled, a calm, terrifying smile. "Let them try. They fight for a king who pays them in coin. We fight for the memory of who we are. Stone does not burn, little one." The siege lasted 2 days. The invaders tried to scale the cliffs, but the Dogon knew every foothold. Stones rained down, cutting the ropes. Frustrated, the enemy commander changed tactics. He didn't attack up, he attacked the water supply. They poisoned the well at the base of the cliff. It was a slow death sentence. The Dogon could fight, but they couldn't survive without water. The wailing of thirsty children began to echo in the caves. Kofi sat in the corner of a cave, guilt eating him alive. He had brought this doom upon them. He stood up. "I have to go down," he told the elder. "I will give them the book. You need water." The elder grabbed his wrist with a grip of iron. "If you give them the book, you poison the future. A thirst for water that can be quenched, Kofi. A thirst for truth, once the well is dry, lasts forever." The elder revealed a secret. Behind the main cave was a narrow fissure, a chimney in the rock that led to the plateau above. It was tight, dangerous, and filled with bats. "You must take the book to the river Niger. There is a boat waiting. It will take you to Jenne. It was a suicide mission. Kofi had to climb up through the dark, cross the open plateau, and descend miles away. But looking at the faces of the children, he knew he had no choice. He strapped the book to his back. The elder pressed a small dagger into his hand. Do not use this to kill, he said. Use it to cut the ropes of your fear. Kofi squeezed into the fissure. The darkness swallowed him whole. The rock squeezed his chest. He climbed blindly, scraping his skin raw, fueled only by the terrified cries from the valley below. He emerged onto the top of the cliff, gasping for air. The wind here was fierce, howling like spirits. He began to run across the flat, rocky tableland. He was exposed. There was nowhere to hide, and he was not alone. The enemy commander had anticipated this. He had stationed a scout on the high ground. A horseman emerged from behind a rock formation, cutting off Kofi's path. This man was huge, his face hidden by a black veil, holding a curved blade. There was no running this time. Kofi stopped. He reached for the dagger, but it felt like a toy against the horseman's sword. The horseman didn't charge. He dismounted slowly. He walked toward Kofi, his boots crunching on the gravel. Profound waste, the man said, his voice muffled. All this for scribbles? He raised the sword. Kofi didn't back down. He remembered the diagram of the lever and fulcrum in the book Physics, Mechanics. As the man swung the heavy sword, Kofi didn't block. He dropped. He slid across the gravel under the swing and kicked the back of the man's knee. The fulcrum. The giant man's leg buckled. Gravity did the rest. The man toppled backward, his heavy armor clanging against the rock. He slid toward the edge of the cliff. He scrambled, grabbing a roost hanging over the abyss. Kofi stood over him. He could stomp on the man's fingers. He could kill the monster. But he looked at the book. The book taught law. It taught justice. That's not vengeance. Kofi turned and ran. He left the man dangling, cursing the boy who had defeated him, not with strength, but with balance. Kofi reached the banks of the Niger River as the sun began to bleed purple into the sky. A small wooden pirogue boat was waiting, hidden in the reeds. An old fisherman sat in it, smoking a pipe. He didn't look surprised to see a battered boy falling out of the bush. The package? The fisherman asked. Kofi tapped the book on his back. The fisherman nodded and pushed off. As they drifted into the strong current, Kofi looked back. Smoke was still rising from the direction of the cliffs. He didn't know if the Dogon had survived. He didn't know if his grandfather was alive. He felt a hole in his heart that threatened to swallow him. He opened the book one last time. The pages were dusty now, slightly bent. He touched the ink. These words had outlived empires. They had outlived the Romans, the Greeks, and now they had outlived the invaders. He realized then that he wasn't just saving a book. He was saving the evidence of his own humanity. Without this, the world would say Africa had no history. With this, they could never lie. Tears finally fell, dropping onto the leather cover. The fisherman rowed silently, the water lapping against the wood, carrying the truth downstream to safety, to be buried again, to wait for a time when the world was ready to read it. The camera moves from the river to a pair of hands wearing white archival gloves. The hands gently open a leather-bound book. We are in a climate-controlled room in 2024. The book is old, cracked, and stained with a single drop of red dye and the dust of the Sahara. A narrator speaks. It is Kofi's voice, but old, ancient. They tried to burn us. They tried to bury us, but they forgot that we are seeds. The camera pulls back to reveal a modern African library in Timbuktu, rebuilt and proud. Tourists and scholars from Europe, Asia, and America are looking at the manuscripts behind glass. They are reading the math, the astronomy, the law. They are realizing that everything they were taught about the Dark Continent was a lie. The story of Kofi isn't just a story. In 2012, when extremists really did attack Timbuktu, hundreds of locals smuggled 300,000 manuscripts out of the city under the cover of night using cars, boats, and donkey carts. They saved the history of the world. The video ends with a close-up of the book's final page. It reads, "Ink flows like blood, but it lasts longer." The screen fades to black. This history is yours. It was hidden, but now you know. If this story moved you, if you felt the heat of the fire and the weight of the book, hit the like button. Subscribe to join the tribe that refuses to let history be erased. I'll see you in the next chapter.